Hello, and welcome to another episode of the series that's tentatively being called Solipsist Watched. We'll see how that goes. I am your host, the Social Solipsist, and in following the last episode, this week I watched Scream, the 1996 film by Wes Craven. Now, if you know me or have been a longtime fan of the channel, then you may be wondering why I watched Scream. So, this whole video is going to include a whole lot of background and meta-narrative, but I'm also going to try and keep it relatively short. The context for me watching Scream is twofold. One is that recently I have been playing a lot of the game Dead by Daylight, a game that I have lots of issues with, but also really like, and that I will be doing a video on, a proper review on once I can, collect my thoughts well enough. But I've also been writing a script for that for about 2 months, so don't hold your breath. And in Dead by Daylight, one of the killers you can play as is Ghostface. Fun side note, the Dead by Daylight devs are kind of shitbags sometimes, and went so far as to not license the thing from Scream. They went straight to the manufacturer of the generic mask that Scream used and purchased the rights to use the mask. So, for all intents and purposes, the version of Ghostface that's in the game is not the same one. Legally, it is apparently legally distinct. Or, well, it's literally the same mask, but they circumvented it. Anyway, fun fact. Playing a whole bunch of Dead by Daylight, and with Ghostface and a number of other killers being more on my mind as a result, I thought I'd go back and watch this film. Now, for personal context, how do I put this? I want to say two things at the same time, which is I'm a big fan of horror films, and also I really don't like horror films. And I'm going to explain that with that dichotomy there with both a bit of history and some discussion of literary standards and other things like that. Anyway, so I am a big fan of certain types of horror films. I would call them horror films, but they do not conform to the horror film standards as pop culture considers horror these days. So you have things like Alien, or The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or there's tons and tons of horror movies that span, ages. But horror has been ruined as a film genre twice. It was ruined once in the late 70s, early 80s, when VHS became a thing. And that is because everybody and their mother could suddenly buy a videocassette recorder and make their own horror films. And there were a lot of really garbage horror films that people made for extremely low budgets. If you are not somehow familiar with this, watch pretty much any Red Letter Media video, especially the best of the worst series, and you will end up seeing 1 or 10. So the horror genre was destroyed once then, and then a second time in 1999. With the release of the Blair Witch Project, which sent the entire horror film genre down this, found footage, low budget path that also exploded it by reminding major studios that they could invest small amounts of money hundreds of times, and as long as one of them paid off tenfold, they'd make their money back. So that has really ruined the genre for the last 20 years or thereabouts. Anyway, I'm not a big fan of, in general, the types of horror films that rely on things like jump scares or just nebulous slasher flicks that expect you to get your enjoyment out of watching people get stabbed to death or gutted or whatever. Not really my jam, not the thing that I find interesting about horror as a genre. I do want to step back a second and say that horror lives in this interesting place, both in film and in other media, specifically in novels and short stories like that, where for a long time in literary circles, horror as well as things like science fiction, romance, a couple of other, kind of specific what was considered genres were grouped under this genre fiction banner. It was literally called genre fiction, and you'll still see that term sometimes around. It doesn't get used that often anymore, but that has gotten more acceptance. But it was sort of a badge of shame for a really long time, especially through most of the 20th century, as a mark of being sort of discount niche literature that was not particularly deep and not particularly interesting and didn't say a whole lot, and it was mostly just cranked out pretty fast to pander to a certain group of people who liked that particular genre. Now, obviously, we talk about genres in film and in literature and in other things as well, with a much more positive attitude. It's a method of classification that, which has its own problems, right? If you get, too pigeonholed into one thing, then suddenly you alienate parts of your audience. Anyway, I won't delve into it too much further. Suffice to say that for a long time, horror was not considered to be particularly highbrow or worthy of consideration in a artistic sense. So, Scream. Scream is made by Wes Craven. It is one of his later films. He is fairly well known in horror circles for being a horror director throughout, I want to say possibly even as early as the 60s, all the way through the 2000s. And he's well known, but not, I don't want to say not well respected, because again, it's a matter of his films and horror films in general being for the longest time considered not high art, not high cinema. But at the same time, they fundamentally are not that great films. They may have some quality to them, but either through lack of artistry or lack of capacity or lack of funding or all of the above, the horror films that have come out for the longest time, including Wes Craven's, are not particularly amazing films to watch. So Scream it's a hard one to talk about because it is very well liked, very well looked upon, because it does some things that are different from your typical horror film. Now, a lot of things get said about the film that I don't think are entirely accurate, having now seen it. Again, I only watched it half an hour ago, so I'm processing my thoughts as I say this as well. But a lot gets talked about it because it is self-referential and meta. It's a meta commentary in a sense on horror as a genre. However, I think it gets too much credit for what it does and doesn't do. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here in the film that make direct or indirect reference to tropes and standards and expectations of horror film viewers. And sometimes it subverts them, and sometimes it does them straight, and sometimes it presents them as like in a pastiche sort of way. But what it isn't is a deconstruction. I have heard that referenced to as a deconstruction, and I do not think it deserves that credit. It's simply not smart enough to be a deconstruction. I have to compare this to Cabin in the Woods, which is from 2011, which is a film I like more, but also a film that I think gets a little bit too much praise. However, Cabin in the Woods is more of a strict deconstruction, although it doesn't go all the way with it. So, what is Scream? I don't know. I don't know what this film is. It's a little bit confusing to watch because it is competently done. It is very clearly done by somebody who has practice with the genre, who is self-aware of what the genre means, what the expectations are, what the representation of characters and tropes and all these other things are. It shirks some of the pitfalls while keeping, obviously with Wes Craven being a horror director, keeping much of the same type of presentation. So reframing parts of the genre with minor tweaks can have substantial effects on the interpretation by the audience. But to say that it's a deconstruction, again, I think is giving it too much credit, if only because there are too many things that it sort of lampshades. It just lampshades an issue and is like, yes, we are self-aware, and that's enough. And my retort is, no, that's not enough. You had something interesting here, and you decided not to go all the way with it, which I think is a bit of a shame. But that said, there are other things where, it doesn't wallow in its gore or its, the mystery of the killer, or overuse things like jump scares or things like that nearly as much as you might expect it to. And that's sort of something I was betting on, because if it had done that, I would have enjoyed it a lot less. Yeah, it's a lot to unpack, really. Because I wanted it to be more, and it just wasn't quite there. Anyway, in general, I enjoyed the film. I enjoyed it more than I enjoy most horror films. I thought there were a lot of aspects of it that were well done, or otherwise more valuable than their non-meta counterparts. But I wish it had taken a little more time and a little more care to go all the way with its self-critique and its meta-narrative. And even if it didn't, lean more into the deconstruction, I think there's more that could be done to paint it as more of a more of a pastiche. One thing that is notable is I was expecting it to be more comedic, because that's often how it's painted in pop culture as well. Interestingly, I can only think of maybe one or two small beats in the entire film that are overtly comedic. And actually, I think that's probably for the best. If it had wavered and tried to do the same plot, but with a comedic, a straight comedic or dark comedy, black comedy type of thing, it wouldn't have worked nearly as well. It would have felt a bit more atonal. But they still did a nice job of getting some less serious aspects into it that keep it from being just sort of dour or falling straight into those same horror tropes and things like that. Anyway, I thought I had more to say about this. I also thought I had less to say about this. And I'm sure I'm going to look back at this in a couple of days and wish I had waited to record this until later and I had processed it more. But anyway, it doesn't matter. That's what this series is. It's my direct reflections on the film. So, whether you are a fan of Scream or not, whether you're a fan of horror or not, I am interested to hear your thoughts on the film or on my reflections on the film in the comments. Thank you guys for watching another episode, and I will see you guys next time.